between ADMU 3 in government and UPM 1 in opposition. Let's give the speakers a round of applause. Note to the audience, make sure you turn off your cell phones, any other device that can make any noise during the debate. Please do not leave or enter the room while the speakers are speaking. If you cannot do that at all throughout the debate, that would be preferable. Speakers, are we ready? Yes, great. So it gives me great pleasure now to invite the first speaker from ADMU, the Prime Minister.
There is a universal consensus of a humanitarian agenda in protecting the lives of indigenous people who we believe are isolated far away from the developments of technologies, who have no access to basic fundamental rights such as medicine, such as proper food, and things like this. And we think that governments are already extending efforts in giving them aid when necessary. And of course, these aids have to be consented to by the indigenous. But we believe that there is a problem when there is an entrance of political religious interests that cloud this humanitarian agenda and make them seem like these humanitarian agendas of giving medicine are a product of Catholic faith, of Muslim faith, for the idea that all of these people must be coerced into their religious practices before they deserve humanitarian treatment. And because of this, we think that when churches build their churches, when religions build their churches in these indigenous communities, when they mandate the allowance of priests to actually come in and settle in, and when they actually, define their own religious territories and require masses before you get aid, we think that there is a problem because this blurs the international sentiment of what we're doing. So what exactly do we want in this debate? We are against the religious indoctrination of indigenous people before they get aid, because we think that it's inconsistent with the international community. We're okay for changing beliefs for the purposes of improving the quality of life of these individuals, but not for the purposes of propagating religion. So this debate is a value judgment. Should we allow the politicization by religious organizations in these humanitarian missions? And by actually looking at the standards of the rationalization of these church influence in these groups, we think that it is inconsistent with the humanitarian agenda. What am I going to talk to you about today? The first one is what should government stance be, and the second one is how the consent to believe is actually compromised. Before I go on, yes.
Most of the things that these organizations do is actually give aid before they actually try to indoctrinate them. We think that it's in their own interest to do so because these people will see them as antagonistic if they do so.
That's not true. What is the motivation of a church to give you aid, but if you don't subscribe to religion? Obviously, there are vested interests that they need to protect, which is why these territories are defined to begin with. The Catholic churches would only give to Catholic territories, while Muslim territories would only be catered to by Muslim individuals. But if you want that model to work, we think that there should be no problem if these religious organizations just give it to the state first, and the state would be the ones to distribute it. Why does it have to come at a religious interest at best? So let's now go on to the first argument. Why is this inconsistent with government stance? Let's characterize why these people are so vulnerable. Because unlike the poor, indigenous people are easily blinded because they are so out of context in today's society. When they see a helicopter, they automatically assume that this is the rebirth of their tree god, which they think is already the most powerful source of influence in that particular community. While poor people might think that this could just be easily shunned away because of the influences and agencies present around them, we think indigenous people have no capacity to consent and to actually rationalize things as much as the modern world. Which is why it's so easy to just bring medicine there that would heal one person and them thinking that it's already a miracle. Because we think that it's these divine interventions, quote unquote, that manifest throughout these religious practices when they actually enter. So how does the government protect these particular kinds of vulnerable people towards that? We want to empower these rights by actually giving them the right to isolate, right? Because we want them to be able to propagate the kinds of choices that they make. But we think that this enabling of choices actually limits itself when there are fundamental human rights that need to be protected, because these things are never absolute. Which is why when we see them dying, we offer them medicine but not at a price. And we think that there is a clear difference by this because the state does does not demand for anything except that you live, versus religion that mandates you to actually join their fold before you're guaranteed your humanitarian existence. And we think that it's easier to subscribe to a particular manifestation of this divine intervention because they're teaching divinity, unlike the state that is just telling you you're human and you deserve these kinds of things. And therefore, when you look at the hierarchy of rights, what goes on first? Is it the religion to actually go there and make them aware of the Catholicism's existence and Muslim existence, or is it their right to life? Because we think there's also a compromise when you try to tie in religion with that of humanitarian development. When people think that we can only access medicine if we actually subscribe to a different faith, you put them at a false decision that they have to do. Do I destroy my identity to further and prolong my life, or is it just to forego whatever kinds of beliefs, whoever I am, so that I could live longer? And we think this is a false statement and a false decision that they have to make, because we think that the state is the only neutral arbiter that could forward the humanitarian agendas at the end of the day. You have, and the opposition has the burden now to prove to us why this is so essential. Because when you take a look at how religious churches intervene, we think that consent is demanded. It's never because you understand our faith now, therefore join our fold. It's really just go to mass, get your aid, go home. And we think that it's this particular kind of discourse that leads us to believe that even the quality of religion that's being given to them is actually poor and at its lowest extent. Because the minimum kind of expectation is really just you signing on at the expense of prolonging your life. And we think that because of the nature of essentiality and necessity, these people are just forced and coerced into subscribing to the faith because of the false decision. So let me now go on to the second one, how the consent to believe is actually compromised. Because we think that missionaries always enter from a higher position of power. Remember coming down from that helicopter, they will never walk there with your clothes and think, hey, I am one of you, try to believe in me. But we tell you that they actually go with a helicopter precisely. They go with all their bad intentions to blind these people exactly so that the establishments and the institutionalization of these places could be done. And we think that it's quite vicious how these religious exploits actually happen because they are heavily funded, they're backed by a huge population, and we think that these minorities have no way to fight against them. Can the government even hold them accountable for what they're doing? Of course not, because even the church is actually so powerful to just barge in there. So we think that the only way that the state could stop them is at the point of entry, but once they get in there, and if your logic is just consent, government could not do anything anymore. So we think that standing in an open space and reaching out to them is not really their method. Their method is to show them cell phones like gas stoves and water purifiers to show them how great they are, how divine they are, and to make these people think that they are the only way to go and all their pagan beliefs are useless. And we think this is dangerous because that's precisely targeting the identity of these individuals. Over the centuries, their cultures and traditions are built on their pagan religions. And once you attack that fundamental norm, these people become drones of whatever you say in terms of the religious institution. They will believe you like their law, and there is no escape. And because of this, we think that the only way to stop it is at the point of entry. We're fine with these indigenous realizing later on and going away to find their religion. But at this point of necessity, at this point of need, when they could so easily be blinded by these divine interventions, we don't think it should be proposed. So with that, we're glad to propose to this side of the house. Thank you.
Very good.
Right, we thank the speaker for his speech and now invite the first speaker of opposition, the leader of opposition.
The clash of the opposition is that we're going to defend the religious freedom to pursue missions even to indigenous groups. And let me clarify the clash in 3 levels. Number 1, when we talk about missions, these are about preaching, evangelization, indoctrination of religious teaching. That's first. Second, in terms of religiously sanctioned missions, such as medical missions housing projects, feeding programs, both to their members as a means of maintaining their membership, but second of all, as a tool to convert other indigenous people to be part of their religion. But second of all, we talk about these vulnerable groups in terms of their need for food and access. It's the primary responsibility of the state to provide for their aid. That means we think that the state should provide for that. But second of all, we don't think that the state should limit individuals and organizations who'd like to extend help to these vulnerable groups in providing whatever they need in status quo. But third of all, there is important state regulation with regards to particular missions that we happen. For example, abusive organizations who profit here from such missions. Or for example, cults who want massive suicide. Or for example, failure of medical missions because they did something wrong in the process that's the most responsive in status quo. Allow me to engage Prime Minister. First, his justification is that it's unfair for religious organizations to attach their name to the activities that they do in terms of charity. I find this ridiculous in a secular society. Primarily because in societies such as the States or even Australia, they allow even for political groups to provide aid by attaching their name and using that to convert them to vote for them. Because the idea is that religion in itself may be utilitarian in nature. And individuals who think that utility is a value that they're willing to uphold must not be bigoted or discriminated by this side of the house. Even the state, Mr. Chair, when you talk about Australia, what they did to the Aborigines in Australia before is that they used the Australian government's name in terms of co-opting them to the policies that they'd like to establish. They gave housing programs, for example, as a tool for correcting historical mistakes. No, thank you. What's the point? The point is that it's not ridiculous and it's not wrong to use your name to co-opt other people for your advocacies and for your goals using the use of missions. Second, they say it's even unfair for you to just, no thank you, to just give aid to your members and to use that to convert. I don't think so. In fact, in a lot of organizations, you allow the religious practice for them to give benefits to their members for various organizations. But number two, they allow them to convert other individuals if the premise is that they believe it's utilitarian. And in fact, in a lot of religious people in this debate, I don't think that it's your really reason to everyone's reason is really just for the abstract and hypothetical use of belief in a divine being. A lot of individuals, no thank you, pursue religious organizations because of the utility that they will get eventually. In fact, it's a legitimate form of decision to make. If they want to be a part of the Catholic religion by getting aid, for example, that is a decision that you shouldn't discriminate on. But lastly, in terms of their ability to consent, in terms of their rationale, I think it's bigoted for the side of the house to say that they are irrational individuals. In fact, in status quo, we create a jurisdiction in terms of identifying vulnerable groups and protecting them in extreme scenarios. But even if, for example, the Islamic people, a lot of you may think that Ramadan is stupid because you fast and it creates a lot of health risk. But the state does not say that you're an irrational individual. Or for example, a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses do not agree for blood transfusion. Some of you might say it's really ridiculous because it's a form of stupidity. But in this case, the state respects those beliefs and those interpretations of individuals. In the same way that when these indigenous groups believe that these are the agents of God who's going to save them from their vulnerability, you don't have a right to discriminate against their consent. Yes.
How would indigenous people have agency when they're against the mandate of heaven? When they don't follow these particular agencies, they'll be burned because that's what they believe in.
No. The concept of indoctrination is that the ability and the flexibility of the indigenous people to change their mindset. In fact, it's a process of discourse. They accept the evangelization, the indoctrination, and they might change from a paganist belief towards that of a monolithic divine being belief. That's an idea of discourse that you weren't able to discuss. The first extension is this: the concept of religious mission as a core element of religious freedom. Let's ground this debate at the most crucial level. The principle of the state is that allows for religion to exist. In fact, it's sanctioned by the United Nations. It is within the constitutional right that religious organization should exist. The premise being is that the state respects the liberty of the individual to define their way of life, or for religious organization to define their moral system. Because the state is not dictatorial and is more liberal in terms of this case. But at the core of religious freedom is their ability to evangelize and indoctrinate, to convert members. Because what is religion in the first place? It's a group of social individuals who are willing to pursue a moral way of life. They are considering a particular way of life that they'd like to do. And the premise is that the existence of organizations rely on the continuance of members and the existence of more members that are faithful to their doctrines, that are willing to accept the way of life that they pursue. What is wrong then with their model? I think it attacks religion at its very core. You stop the religious organization from developing and growing by converting more individuals to be part of the fold. You are restricting their ability to reach out and access vulnerable people. And at the second level, in fact, it's within the religious doctrine of this organization to specifically target the vulnerable people. Because they think that the vulnerable people are those that needed to be saved by God. After all, they don't have any alternatives to begin with. We think it's unfair for you to target the core religious practice of religion in this particular level. But there are a lot of safeguards in status quo. And the state makes sure that there are no violations and corruption that will happen on the ground. We think that this is the best balance that we're willing to create. Because the high threshold for limiting religious freedom or the religious right is a massive social harm. For example, jihad, for example, or massive suicide. These are things that are restricted. But if the individual feels that it's their legitimate right to pursue religious interpretations the way they do so, you should allow for it. The second level of analysis is the idea that religion is an extension of a state tool for social goals. When you talk about indigenous groups, these are marginalized individuals who probably live in marginalized or far-flung areas. In this case, there's a logistical limitation for the state to reach out for them. Realistically, we're talking about a state with finite resources. Ideally, the state should provide for everything that they have. But in the terms of the status quo, where there are willing individuals who'd like to provide help for the state so that they can provide for the basic rights and necessities of these individuals, then it's ridiculous for you to discriminate on that. Because overall, we're talking about the basic right of this indigenous group to health, for example. The basic right for housing. Their basic right for food. These are things that might not be provided by the state, but might be provided by religious organization. And we think it's an extension of the state's right to provide for those rights as well using the tool of religion. We're very proud to oppose.
Right, I thank the speaker for his speech, and now I invite the second speaker from the government team, the Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Chair, we're not against the idea of religious groups participating in humanitarian missions, but we think this is the only level of involvement we can give them. Because if they want to argue to us that government resources are limited, then we say that you can always give your logistical support to the state itself. We don't see exactly why religion has to be part and parcel of that, or crucial even for people to accept this food. Because we say people will accept food or medicine if they need to. They don't need religion to convince them otherwise. If your goal is to help people in that way, we don't see necessarily how religion is a deal breaker. The crucial mistake of the previous speaker is he is not responsive to the nuance that we set for this debate. We're talking about indigenous people who are isolated from the rest of society, who have been stuck with their culture for the last hundreds of years. Why is this important? Because we say whenever individuals are about to make a choice, there has to be a balance of discourse that is available. They have to have a means to correctly evaluate the options that they're going to take. And we say that's effectively taken away when they don't have any access to any other kind of religion or belief system apart from what they have. And two, they're only exposed to that Catholic or Islamic religion, which Patrick already told you is inherently imbalanced against what they originally believed in. And we say this is extremely unfair because from that position of power, the people have no choice but to accept this because their culture is automatically deemed as inferior. Let's go on to my rebuttal for the previous speaker. Because the first thing and the biggest thing he tells us is that, people should be able to freely consent, that let them use religions in whatever way they want. If they want to sign up for a belief and get benefits, that's fine and we should respect that. We say, please sit down, this presumes a fair level of discourse. That people understand necessarily what they're getting into. People don't fully understand, please sit down, that when they say they subscribe to Christ, they have to burn down their idols, they have to abandon their old traditions of worshipping the dead, and things like that. We think that on the level, if you hold them, for example, if you hostage their needs, like food, for example, you tell them that this you must get, in order to get food, you must abandon your religions, then you are putting them in a a compromised position and unable to make this free choice. We think there shouldn't have to be a trade-off between your religion and your survival. Second, he tells us, please sit down, that political parties already indoctrinate people anyway with, for recruitment, for voting and things like that. Exactly, we're challenging this kind of premise because we don't think that this is necessarily fair given that kind of power imbalance. Please sit down. But lastly, they say you're restricting religion's ability to freely evangelize, and they say they must do so. Again, we say there are levels of which we say this evangelization is extremely unfair. We don't think it's very Christian either if you don't give the other side a fighting chance of presenting their side. You can still evangelize, but to people who you know will be more than willing, who can evaluate the options that you will present fairly and not put them in an imbalanced position by which they have no choice but to accept your power. I'm going to talk to you about a few things today. First, I'm going to tell you how these missions take an arbitrary valuation of belief systems and effectively piss on whatever these indigenous people have been believing in for the past centuries. But before that, yes.
What is your standard for an adequate form of discourse for legitimate discourse? Because that argument can also apply for other individuals who think Ramadan is good or blood transfusion shouldn't be done.
We say we can reasonably expect discourse when you live in a society with a preponderance of views, when you live in a society where it's even, remotely possible for you to be exposed to other religions. But when we're talking about totally isolated environments, that simply does not happen. You cannot expect any level of counter-discourse there. First argument on the arbitrary valuation of belief systems. Because let's take a look how these missions are carried out anyway. As Patrick already characterized, there is a power imbalance, but there is more than just shock and awe and showing up with helicopters and vaccines. These missionaries ingrain themselves in the daily life using their technology with their phones, their water heaters, etc., etc. What does this say? The indigenous groups then are forced to make a valuation because part of using these technology, they're also taught that you must believe in the Immaculate Conception. Please sit down. You must believe in the risen Christ, etc., etc. Now these people are forced to make an evaluation. They think, old religion and old technology, so-so life, but new religion plus new technology is a great life to be had. And we think that that kind of premium that you place on these new religions, especially with the kind of benefits that you accord to them, is extremely unfair. Because there's no bias by which they can absolutely counter this kind of discourse. What does this say? With the packaging of technology and the packaging of medicine, with this new religious belief system, you make an unfair valuation that whatever you were doing for the past hundreds of years is absolutely worthless. And the only way to move forward, if you want to be like us, if you want to live with us, is to take these medicines, and part of that is accepting our faith. We don't think that these things have to be forced exclusively. What does this do? First, you tell people that you have to associate your old ways with something that is substandard, something that is uncomfortable, and something that will never be on par with the people who come to you from a position of power. And we think first that's an unfair valuation that you make. But secondly, you force people to abandon their ways simply because you're hostage them by a crucial means to move forward and to better their life. And you tell them there's no better way to do it unless you do it with us and what we believe in. But lastly, yes.
You know what? The pagans believe that the trees are their gods because it provides for their food. Why are you discriminating on their belief that these helicopters are their divine beings because it gives aid to them? The idea is that both sides are parallel.
We say it's not fair because if the tree can provide you with a mango and this missionary can provide you with a mango plus a vaccine plus a chocolate bar, then we don't think you are giving this old mango tree a fair shot at winning the people's hearts and minds. We think it's exactly something that's extremely unfair. Because when you talk about the kind of benefits that you present to them with this new technology and with these old beliefs, we say that the people are forced to make this kind of compromise. They will, because you are so forceful in asking them to accept this new religion and so forceful in asking them to accept this new technology, automatically, implicitly you're saying that whatever they believed in before is worthless and will not help them survive in the future. Face it, the reason why you go to them on these missions is to tell them that you have to be like us. And we think that's perfectly fine, but it does not have to come at the cost of sacrificing the religious integrity and cultural integrity of these people. These means should hold each other hostage and should never be packaged in the same kind of deal. We think it's okay if you want to help them humanitarily, but it's not okay if you use a means of progress as a bargaining chip in order to tell them that whatever you were doing before is totally irrelevant, is totally backward, and is not going to be sustainable in the future if they want to become like these missionaries and continue to receive the benefits that they were accorded. And for all these reasons and more, we're extremely proud to propose. Thanks.
Right, I thank the speaker for his speech, and now we invite the second speaker for opposition, the deputy for peace.
The main goal of affirmative side is to protect these indigenous people in terms of their compromised rationality according to them. We say on the other hand that even if these people have compromised rationality, it is not the role of the state to, number one, decide that they indeed have compromised rationality in these instances. And secondly, I'm going to argue that such compromised rationality, or perhaps an uncompromised rationality rather, is not an absolute value in terms of the state legitimizing the decisions of every individual of the society. But what's the main problem coming from government side? The main problem is that we're essentially giving aid first before we're essentially holding these indigenous people in terms of hostage situation. And I'd like to clarify this skewed rhetoric. Firstly, these particular individuals or these particular missionaries are not taking any food from these indigenous people. They come there, they offer food, Mr. Speaker, in terms of aid, for example. So there's a clear difference between a man pointing a gun at you in the context of duress and that of the idea of denying a charity, which is sequential and a consequence of the altruism of these people. Thus, the idea of duress under compromised rationality does not stand in today's debate, Mr. Speaker and members of this House. But then again, they say that we should protect the culture of these people. And in summary, what they're trying to tell us is that we have to give that mango a fair shot against a helicopter. We think, Mr. Speaker, on the first level, that decision should rest on these indigenous people. And we don't think the state has this particular sort of positive value to actually intervene and protect these particular mangoes, Mr. Speaker, and members of this House. We think that if these indigenous people do believe that such helicopter is better than a mango, then I don't think the state should stop and prevent these people from making these decisions under the guise that they have compromised rationality. And that is exactly what I'm going to tackle in today's debate. I'm going to argue on number one, about the role of the state in terms of intervening in compromised rationality. And second, I'm going to argue on the inherent corrective nature of religion. But before that, yes.
There's no agency with a tree because trees don't talk to you and tell you what to do. A helicopter will. Why humanize that mystification?
I don't understand, Mr. Chair, because frankly, if these people do think and assess by virtue of their utilitarian tendencies that indeed this is better, I think they should first be given that right to be able to access and to at least hear that deal in the first place. We think this is important, Mr. Speaker, and members of this House. So let's zero in on compromised rationality. Because they say that these people, these indigenous tribes, have compromised rationality because they fear the mandate of God and that they're isolated and that they are inherently ignorant. First, we argue that these people do really have their own culture, they have their own way of life and their own political system to such extent that they can rationalize functionally, Mr. Speaker and members of this House. I think given a point, for example, in terms of choosing between a pig or an elephant, in terms of, let's say, who is the meatier or tastier, then definitely these people would still think rationally at the end of the day and would calculate it based on utilitarian means. What's the point? even if these people do live in these far-flung areas, we think, Mr. Chair, that they could make the necessary decisions if they really feel that such people who are foreigners, Mr. Chair, are necessarily just evil, who are just necessarily trying to get money from them, Mr. Speaker, and members of this House. In fact, I don't think it's an automatic case that once people or tribes automatically see a helicopter, they worship it. We think that there are equal tendencies for people to be antagonistic of foreign people in these particular contexts, and such safety measures, such criterion, must be recognized in the context of the psychology of these people, that indeed they could decide functionally, Mr. Chair, and members of this House. But let's talk about fear. And I'm going to argue that it's okay anyway for these people to be fearing on the mandate of God in the context of them having some utilitarian decisions. Because even, Mr. Speaker, in the context of parents telling their kids that, oh, I'm going to spank you if you do something wrong. Or even the government in the context of using the law to tell people that this particular culture is wrong. For example, even if people do have the culture to rape people or to have polygamy, the state's fear and authority are essentially used to correct such instances, Mr. Speaker, and members of this House. What's the link in the context of religious missions necessarily using such fear in terms of creating their advocacies? We think that this is a valid form of criteria, and this is a valid form of reason for them to take, Mr. Speaker, and members of this House. So the idea is this: even if it adds some sense, there is compromised rationality, we think that number one, the state can never be sure of that. But secondly, such compromised rationality could be allowed anyway, because it's not the role of the state to really tell us or to really assure that every individual's decision is objectively assessed in the most rational and empirical manner. Even if a poor individual who has only perhaps $10 in his pocket will necessarily make a life-changing decision to the point that he will gamble all of it, the state recognizes that even if that particular individual has some sort of duress, the state protects the actions of that individual who make these life-changing decisions at the end of the day. Sit down, no thank you. But what's the second analysis? The second is about the inherent corrective nature of religion. Because we're talking here of the Roman Catholic Church or so many other religions, Mr. Speaker. We think that if there are religions who really are making these people hostage to the point that you can't get rice if you don't worship or you face the sky, then definitely, given the characterization of these indigenous people, there is a natural tendency for them to hate those particular missionaries and for them to be antagonistic, Mr. Speaker. What's the point? Those particular beneficial religious missionaries would always go to the extent of balancing such act to the point that they're not necessarily doing the fear that government side is telling us right now. But what is the fear of opposition side? Our fear is it might compromise humanitarian agenda, because this particular religion would not necessarily trust the government and just give them aid, especially in the context of, surprise, surprise, Africa. Why the hell would the Roman Catholic Church trust these particular governments in terms of distributing this money? We think that we need an independent third party that is, number one, trusted by themselves and more trusted by these citizens in these particular areas. For all those reasons, opposition takes this debate. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Speaker, for your speech. And now we invite the third Speaker of the Government Bench to come on stage.
There are two general issues that are very apparent in this debate. The first is a question of weighing rights. Between the right to religious freedom of these religious institutions and the right to isolation of these indigenous peoples, which rights must be prioritized? But secondly, the issue on compromise, consent, and rationality. Is it something that we should tolerate, or if we can avoid it, should we? But let's talk about the first issue on weighing rights. What we heard coming from opposition was an extremely myopic view of this debate. He gave us a very canned argument on religious freedom within a vacuum. What exactly did we hear coming from leader of opposition? He told us that the religious mission is in the core of religious freedom because obviously religious organizations are recognized to exist. It's integral, that indoctrination to spread their beliefs and things like that. But we think that we made it very clear from the very beginning, coming from Patrick, that the rights to isolate supersede the rights of religious freedoms of these religious organizations. And there are two reasons we believe so, things that they haven't even responded to in this debate. Number one, let's talk about precedent. The state always grants greater protections, and the state has always accorded greater protections to minorities over majorities. The minorities that we're talking about in this debate, no thank you, are indigenous peoples, and the majorities that they're talking about in this debate are these really huge religious organizations. So if it's a question of saving a million people versus saving 500 people, we think that the state must always prioritize the rights of the minority because that's always how the state functions. No thank you. Because they even conceded that it's these minorities that are going to be marginalized eventually. But the second reason is this. We need to consider the context of who is being indoctrinated. Because we think that the denial of religious expansion into indigenous peoples is a fringe harm coming from opposition at best. You have 500 fewer believers, 1,000 fewer believers. But we think that that doesn't necessarily harm the practice of religious freedom at the very end of the day. So we think that this harm is extremely fringe at the very end of the day. So this debate has been very clear on the level of principle. It's always going to be about the rights of the minorities. No thank you. We think that we haven't heard any adequate response from that. No thank you. They question further that if indigenous people believe in a helicopter better than a mango, the state simply cannot intervene. This is a false characterization of government treatment of indigenous peoples. Because the government does protect indigenous people from intervention. Because, no thank you, because if they believe that we can wantonly intervene in these indigenous peoples and change their lifestyles absolutely, then we should have already had at it by now. But the fact is, the reason why we maintain the lifestyles of these people is because we respect the right to isolate themselves and because intervention is not absolute. No thank you. So we're very clear about the principles in this debate. No thank you. But let's take a look at the second issue in this debate on compromise, consent, and rationality. Because the fundamental contestation coming from opposition was this idea about how the state cannot make decisions for how much consent of an individual is compromised. The previous speaker points out that there is a difference between duress at gunpoint and when held at ransom by the denial of aid in the future. We think that the difference is very marginal because the only difference is when you're held at gunpoint, you're probably going to die now, but when you're held ransom by aid of these religious institutions, you're going to be dying late in a few months or something like that. We think that the duress will still exist under either circumstance, and that's why we believe that it does indeed compromise rationality. No thank you. The premise that we simply can't accept coming from opposition is this idea and this belief, this absolute belief that indigenous people can make the right decisions, and they even accuse us of being bigoted. Quite frankly, their characterization is misplaced in this debate. Decision-making in discourse relies on a preponderance of information. What does that mean? People need to have all the information possible about everything that this religious institution is doing, no thank you, before they can decide to support or to do something against that religious institution. But the nuance we gave to you from Prime Minister that was never even responded to by opposition was that there is no preponderance of information when we're talking about an indigenous peoples, an indigenous group, where there's only one religious mission that is going there to monopolize information, to monopolize the discourse. So if their basis for agency is so simplistic that these people can just wantonly believe in whatever they want, then we think that there is no true discourse under their model. So we think that that's a very false characterization. But furthermore, they tell us that, you know what, the state is never really sure of compromise rationality because they give the example of a person spending his last $10 for food. No thank you. we told you that we think that this isn't an ideal situation. In fact, if we can monitor and if we can prevent that person with the last $10 spending his money on gambling versus spending his money on food, we would like to do that. So it's basically a question of monitoring and limiting the harms. So we think that this example and parallelism isn't even valid in the context of this debate, because if it is a harm that we can mitigate, which by the way we can do with indigenous peoples, it is something that must be done.
Sir, what is your threshold for discourse? In a lot of individuals, you're not required to read all about religions, you're not required to watch all the television, there is no threshold.
The question, the point is, it's all about exposure. Because while you're not required to read about every single religion, when you're an indigenous person, you only have one religion to read about. It's always about the accessibility of information. So if this course was really going to be genuine under their model, they needed to tell us that there will be a preponderance of information, something which they quite frankly haven't guaranteed in this debate. We think that it's fundamentally coercive when a religious mission goes there, extends food, and tells their people that you will be saved, and that you will be saved if you follow us. And if you don't follow us, we will take your food and you will burn in hell. We think that that's fundamentally coercive, fundamentally insulting to the sentiments of these people. Because if we really think about it, these people will want this aid because it is a basic necessity. So essentially, these religious missions are putting these individuals between a rock and a hard place when they have to choose between their culture and between sustenance. And we think that that providing developmental aid to these people isn't even exclusive to religious missions. Because if their problem is that there aren't enough people who are giving aid to these people, then that isn't even an argument for this debate at all. It's an argument for increasing the amount of aid regardless of religious indoctrination whatsoever. So we think that point was basically moot in this debate. What we've presented to you coming from affirmative is really clear. Firstly, we think that on the levels of principle, in terms of prioritizing rights, it's always about the rights of the minority. We don't think that religions will be harmed as much if we allow this motion to pass. But secondly, we do think that you are coercing these people unnecessarily, and we think that's unjustified fundamentally. And we think that for all these reasons, we think that this motion must stand.
Right, thanks Speaker for his speech, and now I invite the Speaker for Opposition.
Let's first start with clarifying the few characterizations that government has made throughout all this debate. We think that their characterization of these religious missions are necessarily skewed because they think that these missionaries actually hold these people hostage. They withhold food when they actually need it. We think that's a fundamental incompatibility with what these religions are preaching about. These religions preach about preserving life. These religions inherently agree and say that life is something that's sacred. Life is given to you by God. It's something that we have to protect. So we don't think it's reasonable for you to say that they withhold food and other things like that for these particular individuals. The first idea I'm going to tackle is about the value of religious freedom versus protection of indigenous people. Because apparently, that's what they want to say. They want to protect indigenous culture and indigenous people by isolating them and not exposing them to these harmful influences at the end of the day. They said it's actually acts as greater protections. They said that the state actually provides or protects minorities over majorities about their rights. But they say, and we have to clarify, when does the state protect indigenous peoples and in what extent? We say that it protects indigenous peoples from physical harm, whether it's through displacement or marginalization because they lack the services. But it never protects indigenous people from influences outside of their culture, Mr. Chair, and members of this House. It's never the duty of the state to sit down. If it's your value to say that we have to protect the culture and isolate these individuals, then we say it's the state itself doing that by providing them food, by providing them aid. What's stopping from these individuals, these indigenous peoples, from believing that the state is now their new God and it's something that we have to believe in and we have to worship all over again? It's them counteracting their own principle that they have to protect and isolate these individuals at the end of the day. They never also said that well, the state doesn't provide information. It's the value of the state to provide all these sorts of information. Whenever the state goes in and gives aid to these individuals, they never do that, Mr. Chair. They only do it for humanitarian purposes. And whatever value those indigenous peoples attach to that act is something that we should leave up to them, because we say that rationality, by their own decision and by their own definition, is actually present. Let's deconstruct their idea of rationality and how about they decide, Mr. Chair and members of this House. They said that it's a rational decision. It's an irrational decision because they don't have all the information possible. The first question, is that really the characteristic of a rational decision? We think that a rational decision in any instance, in any isolated context, deals with maintaining and looking at the facts as they are and what's available to you right now, and not actually searching and looking for all of these other information at the end of the day. If their counter-proposal or their argument is that, well, they're not exposed to all these other factors, we think there are other counter and parallel examples that can decide this. Please sit down. If you parallelize it to children, they may be exposed to other sorts of information, but we think that families dominate whatever sort of information that gets to them eventually. And the state doesn't regulate that in terms of how religion actually dominates that sort of information. The state doesn't say that, well, let's inform the children of all the possible religions in all of the world before you can make a decision about your religion. Please sit down. We think, Mr. Chair and members of this House, that the preponderance of information is not exactly the reason why we have to isolate them from making these particular decisions. Rather, what we said from negative side is that if they see a value in believing in something like this, if they see a value in believing a helicopter over a mammoth tree, we think that's something that's okay with us, and we think that's something that we should celebrate in fact. And we think, Mr. Chair and members of this House, on the second idea, of the value of religious freedom, Mr. Chair, we think that it's a core value and a core and direct value for them to actually have this evangelization at the end of the day. They said, well, it's just 500 or 1,000 members that lacks it. But we think that when you have this policy, you directly attack the mandate of those individuals to save all individuals on this earth. These missions are actually mandated to actually save everyone, to make them, to save God, to make them be saved by God, Mr. Chair, and members of this House. But more than that, we think it's an attack on religious freedom, primarily because you don't agree and you don't attach their name to whatever act that they're doing. And we think that when you allow it in other instances, even in instances where they are marginalized and not able to do anything about it, about getting more information, we still allow them. That's why we think it's problematic on your paradigm. Yes.
Following that logic, is it really an option to evangelize? Because if you're trying to forward your right to religion here, then that means all the kinds of aid will always have intents behind them.
Yes, we don't have a problem with aid having intent behind it. As long as there is aid impact. As long as, if your problem is that, well, if we have a problem with aid, Mr. Chair and members of this House, we think that in your paradigm, you decrease the amount of aid that gets to these individuals because they won't get any aid at all. And we think that's a direct harm that you never responded to and never considered at the end of the day. We say, Mr. Chair and members of this House, that the direct harm to that it's an irrational doctrine. It's an irrational doctrine for them to withhold food when it's needed. That's why we think that in terms of protecting these indigenous peoples, we think that there are boundaries to be set up. There are boundaries, concrete boundaries that the state has to do, Mr. Chair and please sit down, members of the House. That's why, at the bottom line, Mr. Chair, of this debate, look at the two current issues and the two main issues in this debate. Are these decisions really irrational from the point of view of the state and of these individuals? What type of rational decision-making is required by the state, Mr. Chair, members of this House? And we think it's with the opposition side. When we told you that information right now, information that they have right now is enough. But more than that, Mr. Chair, we have to consider and we have to analyze how exactly do these preachers or these religious individuals actually conduct their ideas. It's not as if they're forcing them down their throats. We think that they teach them love and faith and respecting your neighbors and valuing your family. And we don't think that they do that by putting hair dryers here. I have a hair dryer, and you should love and respect God or something like that. We think it always has to have similarities with the ideologies of these individuals or these indigenous peoples. And we think that's something that they really do and validly do in the status quo. And that's the more rational and reasonable characterization of how religious missions do. Do their decisions actually promote or go towards that believing of these religions? We think to a certain extent, yes. But is it harmful to society? Number one, never was there any response to that. Is it harmful to these indigenous peoples? There was no response to that at all again as well. So we think, given these practical and principal causes, we think that opposition should take this way.
Right, thank the Speaker for his speech. We now move to the reply portion of the debate, and as is usual, we'll begin with opposition.
The first fatal mistake on government side is to judge religions based on their own framework of mind. Remember, they themselves are defending that paganism is okay. It's okay for you to worship trees and to worship the heavens, for example, as your gods. Even if pagans don't have TVs in their locality, even if they don't have access to internet, even if the extent of discourse is not present. Because we ask the question, what's the difference of that particular utilitarian perspective with seeing helicopters as the source of their food, medicines, and chocolates? Both instances are equally valid, and even paganism don't have the level threshold that you're expecting them to have. The second fatal mistake is this. Eventually, they are willing to defend that it's an absolute value to preserve cultural religion for the state. In fact, the argument of Alan is that it's the right to religion versus the right to be isolated. Number one, I never heard from the first two constructive speakers that they're willing to defend the right to be isolated. But number two, there was no adequate constructive quiet of why the right to be isolated is an important value to begin with, in contrast to our constructive that religious freedom in multiple levels is the duty of the state to protect. But second level of analysis is this. If society perceives that paganism should be abandoned, if the local indigenous groups believes that they're going to change their mindset, who are you to restrict them and say, you know what, you should go with isolation, you should go with preserving your culture? That's ridiculous. The state gives individuals the right to do that. But the third level of the second fatal mistake is this. Even the state actively intervenes in this region. They introduce a lot of secular concepts. They change their mindset. They change their ideas of what society and human rights is all about. That means it's not a value for the state to preserve cultural stagnation and your right to be isolated. The third fatal mistake of side government is this. They said it's an irrational decision making because they are isolated. Number one, we asked, what is your threshold of that particular isolation? Because even every one of us here, we do make decisions, even we don't watch TV, even we don't have that adequate exposure. At least it's reasonable for your side of the house to say, what's the extent of level of discourse are you willing to take in today's debate? But even if they're isolated, it does not stop them from comparing their own religion with a new religion eventually. That ability and faculty to compare various religions will always exist, even if the exposure is limited. In this case, we think that they themselves are capable to make that decision. So the eventual implication is this. If a religious institution will bring TVs in those isolated regions, then now you're okay with it? I don't think that the threshold was used in this side of the house. The fourth ridiculous ridiculous, sorry. The fourth fatal mistake of the side of the house are their ridiculous fears. Because their first fear is that there will be coercion, like you will be forced to be part of the religion. Number one, we already said that religious organizations' doctrine of charity to begin with would make us reasonably assume that if an individual would die already, obviously they would give the food because that's the dire need of the individual. It's ridiculous for them to say, no, they're not really going to give it. But the second level of rebuttal is within our constructive analysis. We already said that the state sanctions selective aid giving to the members of their own organization. Or third, it's not their first duty to begin with to provide for the aid within this particular people. It's the state's responsibility to begin with. That's the reason why you don't have an authority to force them and things like that. But the second fear is that there's an absence of full discourse. Even the state does not really provide counter-analysis, say, if you're going to give political campaigns in those regions. But second of all, it allows also for other religious organizations to infiltrate those local regions or even members of the state to counterbalance analysis. I don't think why that's not a mitigable harm in today's debate. But this is the question. What is the difference of that rationality of an individual who thinks that Ramadan, for example, and denial of blood transfusion is a legitimate choice? We think the utilitarian choice of these pagans are positive to begin with. But the last fatal mistake is this: their inability to engage the values in today's debate. We were very strong in our constructive of religious freedom, which is not a canned argument, Alan. Shame on you. We say that this is a form of conversion. This is their primary doctrine to specifically target vulnerable people. And that's the core element of religious freedom, which you are denying them. But lastly, you are also denying the opportunity for the pagans and for the indigenous groups to have the basic right to food, to medicine, when the state fails on that. I think that's a higher value than all your stagnating values.
Right, so thank the speaker for his speech. For the final speech of this pre-Octo finals, I now invite THW.
It's quite easy to smell desperation with an 11-minute whip speech coming from opposition. Because what is this debate really about? Their burden is to show why is it essential to carry out human rights agenda that are UN chartered with religion. Because as much as they tried to prove their negative case, Mr. Chair, against our positive, they never really showed us why it's inherent for these religious groups to be affiliated with the human rights agenda anyway. So in that regard, it's impossible for them to win. But let's look at the pragmatic level, because they tell us that there is an incapacity of the state. This is quite of a tension with the model coming from leader of opposition. Because if it tells us that churches are able to give out perfectly before they start preaching, which is why we can trust them, then why can't they just give it to the government if they're so apolitical anyways at the end of the day? But even so, that's contradictory to the second point, when he tells us that, you know what, they have religious vested interests and they have to protect their right to evangelize, which is non-existent, mind you, but more than that we think would lead to an abuse because your end goal would always be to coerce these people. So these intentions are already there, no response coming from you. And with trying to build that up, we don't think that should be valid. What is this debate about in principle really? This debate is not about choice, it's about consent. And there's a clear difference with what I mean by that. Because in status quo, rationality is based on how effectively it can be monitored and enforced. And if we can monitor the indigenous people to assert greater levels of rationality, why shouldn't we? It's not enough to tell us that you have made a choice and you should be accountable to it when you're fully uninformed. And if they're telling us that knowledge is so important for this choice to manifest, then why do you limit them with the kind of information of the circumstance that they are in? Which is why let's now go on and assess this debate. If the basis of agency, which Robert was trying to explain in his constructive whip, is so simplistic, how does that translate to discourse? Because the quality of information that he argued at DLO was really just a comparison of mangoes, a comparison of utility, which, mind you, in the real world will not be your sole basis for any decision making. Which is why the standard of consent, not choice, is full and free. And we think that it's everyone's right to be able to access these things first before we grant them choices. It's quite noble to tell us that they made the decision and that they should be able to make it. But the process of agency was never explained in your side. They're out of this world and we think they have limitations in terms of what they can scope. And we think that given that access is the only kind of imperative and the only kind of basis that they're going to base their decisions to, should we consider this choice valid. That was the debate. They were never in it. Let's now go on to the second issue. Can we trust the church at all times? Because this debate revolves around a power imbalance. And we think that they never really recognize that when the church starts going in there, they're not going to be all free giving. Because as we told you earlier, these churches have intentions and they will do anything they can, blinding you with helicopters, giving you radios and things like that to show you that they are God. What is your escape as an Aborigines that is stuck in this particular primitive and traditional location? Can you get the discourse anyways at the end of the day, given the simplistic agency that you have and the kinds of information that you have? Of course not. Which is why we think that if you compare this particular kind of protection to your right to evangelize, go evangelize in a city, go evangelize in other places. Why in these indigenous places, for instance? Because these people are vulnerable. That's the special context of this debate. We tackle that over and over, no response coming from them. It's impossible to believe their take also on politicization and how politicians actually just try to get your voting power because the agency is different. Here you're against the mandate of heaven, here you're against a politician. In terms of discourse, you could think more against this than that if you want to escape. But more than that, we already talked to you about how the imposition actually occurs. Because we think that the likelihood of discourse coming from religion is impossible because we think that there is a monopoly in terms of stature in that particular area. No other force is greater than you. There is no competing balance of power. Therefore, we think that these people, once they bite into the first choice, would necessarily serve these as gods. And especially when you're giving them a face through that helicopter priest who's delivering aid, unlike a chief, this guy can tell you what to do. He can tell you to follow him. And we think that this humanization of mysticism actually adds to the kind of coercion that you have. No responses, you lose this debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I thank all the speakers for ready to take up again.